In this video, we will discuss about the muscles of thoracic wall proper. As you all know, the skeletal framework of the thoracic wall is formed by thoracic cage. The spaces between the ribs are called as intercostal space. There are total 9 intercostal spaces anteriorly and 11 intercostal spaces posteriorly. These intercostal spaces are filled by intercostal muscles, as well as they also contains intercostal vessels, nerves and lymphatics. In this video, we will only discuss about the intercostal muscles. Intercostal muscles are of 3 groups. The outermost one is the external intercostal, then comes the internal intercostal muscle, and this innermost group is transversus thoracis muscle, which is having 3 subparts: subcostalis, intercostalis intimi, and this one is Terno Costalis part. Before we go into the details of these muscles, we need to learn about few parts of the ribs. Here is a typical rib. This one is the upper border of the rib. This one is lower border of the rib. This part is called as costal groove. This part is head, which articulates with the vertebra posteriorly, and slightly lateral to the head there lies a part called as tubercle of the rib. This part is called as angle of the rib. We will now discuss the extent of these muscles. The muscle shown in the first space or the space intercostal space above is the external intercostal, which extends from the tubercle of the rib posteriorly up to the costochondral junction anteriorly. The portion of the external intercostal between the costochondral junction and the sternum is known as anterior or external intercostal membrane. The internal intercostal muscle extends from the sternum anteriorly up to the angle of the rib posteriorly. The portion of the muscle between the angle of rib and the vertebra is known as posterior intercostal membrane. The subcostalis muscle is confined to the posterior part of the lower intercostal spaces only. The sternocostalis muscle is confined to the anterior part of the upper intercostal spaces only, and the intercostalis intimi is confined to the middle 2/4 of all the intercostal spaces. As we have already discussed, this sternocostalis, intercostalis intimi and subcostalis are the part of transversus thoracis muscle. We will now discuss the origin and insertion of this muscle. The external intercostal muscle arises from the lower border of the rib above the space, and it inserts into the outer lip of the upper border of the rib below the space. The internal intercostal muscle arises from the floor of the costal groove of the rib above the space, and it inserts on the inner lip of the superior border of the rib below the space. The costal groove have already shown before. The 3 parts of transversus thoracis muscle are subcostalis, intercostalis intimi and sternocostalis muscle. The subcostalis muscle arises from the inner surface of the rib near the angle, and it inserts on the inner surface of the 2 to 3 ribs below. It is confined to the lower ribs only. The intercostalis intimi arises from the middle two-fourth portion of the ridge above the costal groove. This part is floor of the costal groove, and this dark line is the ridge above the costal groove. The intercostalis intimi inserts on the inner lip of the upper border of the rib below the particular space. The next muscle is Terno Costalis, which is having multiple origin sites. It originates from the lower 1/3 of the posterior surface of body of sternum, from the posterior surface of the xiphoid process, and posterior surface of costal cartilages of lower 3 or 4 true ribs. After originating from these three sites, that is posterior surface of the lower part of the sternum, posterior surface of xiphoid process, and posterior surface of the costal cartilages of lower 3 or 4 true ribs, it goes to insert over the costal cartilages of second to sixth ribs. Having learned the origin and insertion of intercostal muscles, we will now learn the direction of these muscles. As you can see over here, fibers of external intercostal muscles run downwards, forwards, and medially, whereas fibers of internal intercostal and transversus thoracic muscle run downward, backward, and laterally. These intercostal muscles are supplied by the intercostal nerve of the particular intercostal space. The main action of the intercostal muscle is to prevent this intercostal space from being drawn in during the inspiration and bulging outward during the expiration. Apart from this, the external intercostal muscle and interchondral part of internal intercostal, this much portion, interchondral portion between the costal cartilages, interchondral portion of internal intercostal, and whole of the external intercostal muscle elevate the rib during inspiration, and the remaining portion of the internal intercostal, the portion between the ribs, that is intercostal portion of the internal intercostal, and transversus thoracic muscle, depress the rib during expiration.